Welcome to Dark Whispers, where the darkest secrets come to life. Today, we enter a world where the hospital walls hold macabre secrets, revealed only by the whispers of the nurses who witnessed the horror. Don't forget to subscribe and leave in the comments, what stories would you like to see, but anyway, enjoy the video.
Good evening, everyone. For privacy reasons, I will not reveal any names or the community where I live. Many years ago, I worked as a nurse in a small clinic. It was a rather expensive facility that operated 24 hours a day, and I worked the night shift since I had to take care of my young children during the day. On my shift, there was only one other nurse and the receptionist. The doctor was not present unless there was an emergency. There were only a few patients admitted at the time, and among them was an elderly lady who had been there for several days. Her kidneys were not functioning properly, and her health was severely compromised. Her children had made great efforts to keep her at the clinic, given the high cost of the facility. One night during my rounds, as I was checking on the patients, I entered the elderly lady's room and came across a terrible scene. She had used a razor blade to cut her wrist. There was nothing more I could do for her, as her vital signs had disappeared. She had left a letter for her children, explaining that she could no longer bear to see them struggle to pay for her treatment, as she knew her illness was incurable. Days passed after this grim event, and one night while I was in the hospital cafeteria, completely alone, I saw a shadow out of the corner of my eye passing by the window. I couldn't identify who it was as the blinds were partially closed, but I could tell it was a patient due to the white gown they were wearing. I went out to see who it was, but the corridor was empty. I then went up to the reception desk, which was on the same floor as the cafeteria, and asked the receptionist if she had seen any patients roaming that floor. She said that no one had passed by there. I went up to check on the patients in their rooms, and they were all in their beds that night. At that moment, my colleague, the other nurse who worked the shift, arrived and asked me if we had a new patient. I said no and asked why she was saying that. She had a confused expression and told me that when she was leaving her car, she saw a patient looking through the window of one of the rooms up there, in the corner where the tragedy had occurred with the elderly lady. That's why she thought it was strange, as that room had not been occupied since then, and she thought someone had been admitted there. I told her that no new patient had been admitted and that I had just checked on all the patients, and they were all sleeping in their rooms. We looked at each other for a few seconds trying to find an explanation. We went to have a coffee while discussing what had happened. At that moment, the janitor, who had been working there for only a week, came in visibly scared and told us that there was a patient upstairs, and that we should hurry. We immediately went out and ran to the second floor. But all the patients were sleeping peacefully. I, already a bit irritated, went to talk to the man and complained to him, saying that playing with something like that was not appropriate. He looked at me surprised and said, "I swear to God I wasn't lying. I was washing the corridor on the second floor when I saw an elderly lady at the end, and she had her wrists bleeding and was crying. I ran to tell my colleague what had happened as I didn't know what to do." She spoke calmly to the man, telling him that everything was okay, and that he didn't need to worry, thanking him for the information. Then she touched my shoulder and said, "She is the lady from that tragic day." I really hesitated to believe that, but what other explanation could there be? After that night, we continued to see someone, a woman, looking through the window of that room every time my colleague and I arrived for work. Some of our patients also told us that they saw an elderly lady walking through the hospital corridors. They would often call us to say that a patient needed help, as she was wandering the halls crying. The patients thought it was someone who was admitted there, as they didn't know the story of that lady. We would simply thank them and say we would check, but we never told them the reality. We didn't want to frighten them. As time passed, I moved to a different city, but I kept in touch with my colleague. Over the years, she told me that the elderly lady was still trapped there, and she believed she would never leave. That room had to be used as a storage room, as no one could bear to stay there for a single night due to the many paranormal occurrences. Patients who were placed in that room reported that during the night, an elderly lady would watch them from the corner of the room, only to mysteriously disappear. Thank you for listening to my experience. This work was certainly not without its challenges. The story I am about to tell is incredibly disturbing and chilling. My name is Laurel, and I was a nurse at a public hospital in a city I'd prefer not to mention, located in the interior of Dakota, where I covered the night shift on certain days of the week along with a colleague. My colleague and I were responsible for the entire third floor. It all started on a rather quiet night at the hospital, as we didn't have many patients, and everything was going smoothly on our shift. Suddenly, I heard a terrifying scream coming from one of the rooms at the back of the corridor. I immediately rushed to check the 2 occupied rooms in the section I was in, but upon entering, I found both patients sleeping. Couldn't have been them. I went to verify the other rooms to ensure no one was there, as I was certain of what I had heard. However, all the other rooms were empty. I made my way to the other side of the floor where my colleague was caring for the other patients, as he had asked me to cover for him for a while he made a phone call. After a little while, I was in a patient's room, administering their medication to help them sleep, when an eerie, piercing scream echoed through the corridors again. The scream came from far down the opposite corridor. It was something chilling, like a wail of anguish. I don't know how to describe how horrific that sound was. My patient also heard it and looked at me with wide eyes. I immediately went out to check once more to try to find the source of the sound. I made my way down the corridor and heard the scream again. I was convinced it was coming from room 27. I approached the door but hesitated before opening it, as I was too afraid. I opened the door slowly, turned on the light, and to my surprise, the room was completely empty. I turned off the light and closed the door. As I was walking back down the corridor with my back to the door, I heard someone crying. The crying was coming from the same room I had just left. It was the cry of a small child. Overcome with fear, I didn't want to open the door again and instead decided to wait for my colleague. However, I continued to hear sobs and moans, which was incredibly unsettling. Finally, my colleague returned and I told him everything that had happened. I asked him to accompany me to check again, as during the entire time he had been away, very sinister noises had come from that room. As we approached, we could clearly hear the crying of a child. He made a sign for me to be silent as he slowly opened the door. But when the door fully opened, the crying stopped. He turned on the lights and once again the room was empty. We were extremely frightened and perplexed by this, and we then left the room trying to find an explanation for what had happened. My colleague had to continue with his work in his section, and I stayed caring for my patients. Conversing with one of these patients, a young man who had been there for several days, he asked me about what was happening with the child in room 27. He said he heard the crying very frequently and wanted to know why the parents weren't taking care of the child. I did not know how to respond as this was the first time I had heard that crying while working there. So I told him that there was no patient in that room and that at the moment, we did not have any children admitted on the floor. He looked at me surprised and was silent for a few seconds, then told me that every night, a small child would approach the door of his room, not opening it completely, just leaving a small crack. This small crack was enough for him to realize that it was a child. He would always ask the child's name, but the boy never responded, just turning around and leaving. One day, he had opened the door to follow where that child was going, and he saw that she was entering room number 27. That's why he thought there was a sick child there. When he finished telling me all this, he looked at me with eyes full of uncertainty and fear. I confess I was also very frightened, but I didn't want to leave him nervous and jeopardize his health, so I told him that I might have been mistaken and that there could possibly be a child in another room on that floor, but I asked him not to worry. However, he was not fully convinced. I went directly to look for my colleague to tell him everything the young man had told me. He was also surprised and didn't know what to say to me. He said he didn't believe in ghosts and that there wasn't much we could do, as we were both new at the hospital and did not know the history of that room. The next night when I arrived at work, I learned that a patient had been. I was at a loss for words when the doctor told me the patient had been placed in room 27. I didn't say anything at the time, but when the doctor was leaving and giving me instructions about the medications and care for the patient, I couldn't help but ask why she had been placed in that room when there were many unoccupied rooms. The doctor, with a doubtful expression, asked if there was a problem. I said no, that it was just a curious question, as I didn't want to reveal the real reason. I was too ashamed to talk about it, knowing he wouldn't believe me. He responded that there was no specific reason for the choice of room 27. I proceeded with my work normally as any other night. Around 2 a.m., when all the patients were already asleep, there was complete silence on the floor when suddenly I heard a scream. However, this time it was not the same one I had heard before. It was coming from the back of the corridor, exactly in the direction of the room where the new patient had just been admitted. I rushed to see what was happening. When I entered the room, the patient was on the floor. I hurried to help her, and she appeared very frightened. I helped her up and then turned on the light, asking what was happening. She said that she was about to fall asleep when she felt a small hand touch her arm, followed by a murmur that she couldn't understand. She said she was so scared that she jumped out of the bed and ended up falling on the floor. I was at a loss for words and didn't know what to say to this patient. I simply asked if she hadn't seen anyone enter the room, but she said she hadn't seen anyone. However, she asked me not to leave her alone as she was very afraid. Since she had been transferred to that room, she had felt a sense of apprehension and anguish. She had asked the doctor to let her husband stay in the room as a companion, but the doctor did not agree, as the hospital was very strict about that. She asked me to stay with her, even if it was just until she fell asleep, and I agreed. I tried to calm her down, telling her that everything would be fine and that I would be there. And so it was during the entire time I was there. I can't explain the feeling of fear and discomfort that hung in that place, but I couldn't leave the woman alone. Thanks to the medication, she was able to fall asleep quickly. I turned off the light and went to check on my other patients. Not even 3 minutes had passed when I heard a horrible scream, the same child's scream I had heard the night before, coming from the same room. I ran knowing the woman was there. When I entered and turned on the light, the woman was on the floor again, but now unconscious. She had suffered a heart attack. I urgently called the attending physician, and we tried to resuscitate her several times. I swear we did everything to save her life, but it was no use. The woman passed away. The doctor asked me if anything unusual had happened, as he couldn't understand how the woman, who had entered with a stomach problem and was not seriously ill, had a heart attack seemingly out of nowhere. I could no longer contain myself and told him everything. I told him everything that had happened since the previous day, doing my best not to cry. He responded, "It's all right, calm down. When your shift ends, come see me in the cafeteria." I didn't know why he wanted to speak to me, but I agreed. After my shift the next morning, I went to the cafeteria as the doctor had requested. He said, "Have a seat, I want to tell you." And so he began to tell me what he believed had happened. He said he had been working at that hospital for many years and was an experienced doctor. He explained that when he was just starting there, the hospital belonged to a very successful and powerful man at the time, and what he was about to tell me for my own good could not leave this place. I could not tell anyone for my own safety. He said that during that time the hospital was often used for illegal activities, referring to the illegal trade of, I don't want to be too explicit, but you know what I'm talking about. It was the true business of that man along with a criminal group. They would carry out everything in the hospital's basement, where there were only storage rooms that were used to store some materials. I asked what all of this had to do with what I had told him about the child, and he said, Look, one night they brought in a child who was seriously injured after being hit by a car. He was taken to the intensive care unit, and after that they put him in that room number 27. His parents said goodbye to him at night when visiting hours ended and went home. However, the next day when they came back to see him, the nurses gave them the news that their son was no longer in the room. He continued, they said that the next morning when the nurse did her rounds, he was no longer there, and they had already searched the entire hospital, but there were no traces of him. The parents could not believe what they were hearing. The mother started screaming, questioning how they could have made such a mistake, and asking if they had already called the police. However, they responded that the hospital director at the time had prohibited calling the police, as he did not want to cause a scandal. The father, furious, immediately went out and alerted the authorities. The police arrived quickly and began to interrogate the staff, requesting the surveillance camera footage, but they said it wasn't working, which was already quite suspicious. They requested reinforcements to search the hospital. When they reached the basement, they were confronted with a very disturbing scene. I won't be explicit, but you can imagine the horror of that scene. It was a true scene of terror, that's all I will say, and you can have an idea of what they found. They found the poor child, but the culprits were never found, as they had already fled along with the owner of the hospital, who has still not been located. The hospital was closed for several years, although a lot of money was paid to keep everything hushed up, which is why not many people know the history of the place. But getting back to the subject, this child was one of many victims of human brutality and greed. After several years, when the hospital reopened under new owners, many people who stayed in that room, number 27, experienced paranormal phenomena during their stay. Many were transferred to other rooms, and some claim to have seen and even spoken to that child, who still seems to wander the corridors. I thank the doctor for telling me the story, which ultimately left me much more nervous and sad, but I finally understood everything. Now I knew who that child was and why they cried on those nights. After some time I was transferred to another hospital, but I still maintained a friendship with my former colleague, who continued to tell me everything that was happening in that place, especially in room 27.
We are constantly working to improve the quality of our content and provide increasingly chilling moments. We want to hear your opinion. Leave in the comments what you thought of the changes and what we can do to improve even more. If you're not subscribed yet, don't waste any time. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any spooky videos from Dark Whispers. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed the video and share it with your friends who also love a good dose of terror. We're excited to continue this sinister journey with you. Until the next plunge into the shadows. And remember, keep the lights on. Goodbye.